Life did not prepare me for such turns. I had everything and lost everything in one moment. You will be shocked to know how I survived after what happened. I still shake when I think back, but I could not even imagine that it would get worse. The ending will definitely shock you. The burner had been flickering again, just the left one. Wouldn't catch like it used to. That morning I dropped to my knees, screwdriver in hand, half a cup of cold coffee still sour on my tongue. Grease smudged under my nails as I eased the screws from the bottom panel and pulled the faceplate back from the stove. I expected a clogged line or maybe some ash buildup, but instead I found a bundle jammed awkwardly behind the cabinet corner, wrapped in an old dish towel. It was dusty like it had been there for weeks, maybe longer. I pulled it out slowly, turning it over once before the towel loosened. 2 concert tickets slipped out and fluttered to the floor like a pair of dead butterflies. They were for some arena in Seattle. Headliner was a band I didn't know, but the date slapped me harder than the rest. Next weekend. I stared at the city name again. Seattle. We had never been. Hell, she once said she hated the idea of the place. Too rainy, too loud, too far. I stood up and wiped my hands on the back of my jeans, waiting to feel something clear. I didn't. When I asked Hannah about them later that evening, she barely flinched, said she'd won them on the radio a month ago. Some call-in trivia thing she forgot to tell me about. I watched her over the rim of my glass as she cut carrots on the board, her hands steady, her voice smooth. She said she'd given them to a friend. Said it like it meant nothing, like we hadn't spent the last 7 years scraping our lives into a rhythm built on honesty and leftover pasta. I wanted to press, but didn't. I just nodded, swallowed the question forming behind my teeth. That night she came to bed in silence. I waited until she fell asleep, her back curled toward me, the curve of her spine breathing in and out like the waves I used to trust. The next morning I noticed the jacket. She was putting dishes away, arms raised, and that's when the name caught me, embroidered across the chest in bright yellow thread. Eddie's Auto Repair. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't hers. The sleeves were too long. It hung from her shoulders like a memory she wasn't trying to hide very hard. When I asked, she said it was just something she picked up from the thrift store. But I know every thrift store in town. I've hauled boxes to all of them when her spring cleaning kicks in. That jacket had a story she wasn't telling. I didn't sleep that night. Something in my chest had started clicking out of sync, like a loose gear grinding behind my ribs. I stayed up late staring at the ceiling, watching the fan turn shadows into shapes I didn't recognize. By morning, I still hadn't shut my eyes. I stood up slow, cracked my back, and walked into the bathroom. I hadn't showered. Not yet. I was going to, but the mirror was already fogged up when I walked in. There was a handprint on the glass, palm facing out, fingers splayed. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. I pressed my own hand next to it and felt the air go cold. It didn't match mine. Whatever thoughts I'd been pushing down since the stove, since the tickets, since the jacket, they came crawling back in that moment like wet vines through a broken window. That print on the mirror, it wasn't a sign. It was proof. I didn't know what yet, but something had already broken, and I'd missed the sound of it shattering. She was humming downstairs, something soft and tuneless, and for a second it made my skin itch, because now I couldn't tell if that sound had always been hers, or if I'd just been imagining her into someone I wanted to believe in. I rinsed my face and didn't say a word. The next weekend would bring more than just a concert. It would drag secrets into the light that had been coiled in the corners of our home like dust spiders. I was done pretending, but I wasn't done watching. Saturday morning cracked open quiet and hollow, the kind of morning where the house feels too still, too calm, like it's holding its breath. I zipped up my old hiking bag, slipped a pair of sandwiches into foil, and told Hannah I was taking Mason out to the hills for some fresh air. She smiled without meeting my eyes. Her lips stretched, but the warmth never touched the corners. Mason was already in the car, buckled up with that innocent, restless energy only 8-year-olds carry. I ruffled his hair, and he grinned. He didn't know I wasn't just taking him hiking. I was stepping back from the edge, just far enough to look over it with both eyes open. Before we left, I took the camera from the workbench in the garage. A small thing, barely bigger than a pack of smokes. I'd bought it weeks ago to document a busted tile job in the bathroom I'd been putting off, but that wasn't what it would be for today. I slipped it behind the stack of towels beneath the sink, angled just right to catch the hallway and the bathroom door. No one would see it. I'd already made sure the motion sensor was turned off. It would record in silence, in real time, while I disappeared into the mountains. The hike was quiet. Mason chattered about school, about dinosaurs, about some kid named Riley who always cheated at dodgeball. I nodded, laughed when I needed to, but my thoughts were somewhere else, pinned to images of jackets, concert tickets, and that phantom handprint. Every mile we climbed put a little more distance between me and what I feared I'd see when we got back. But it didn't ease the weight on my chest. If anything, it made it heavier. Like I already knew the footage would confirm what I wasn't brave enough to say out loud. We spent the night near the ridge, huddled in a nylon tent that flapped and moaned in the wind like a haunted lung. I barely slept. The fire died around 2, and Mason's breathing turned soft and rhythmic. But I just lay there, staring up through the mesh toward a sky that didn't blink. By Sunday night, we were back. I told Hannah we'd hit traffic and that I was dead tired. She didn't ask questions. She never did. Her eyes flickered across my face like she was searching for something, but she didn't speak. Just went upstairs with a half-empty glass of wine and shut the bedroom door. I waited until the house was still, until Mason was out cold and the wine glass sat untouched on the nightstand, and then I went to the bathroom. My fingers didn't even shake when I pulled the camera out and hooked it to the laptop. The file loaded slow. I sat on the floor, back pressed to the cold tile, and watched. At first there was nothing, just stillness, shadows moving with the light, dust floating like ghosts in the air. Then, around 1:10 in the afternoon, he walked in. The camera caught everything. Mechanic's uniform, dark boots, a face I didn't know, but I recognized the logo on his chest, Eddie's Auto Repair, the same embroidery that had brushed across my wife's collarbone a few days ago. He stepped in like he owned the space, like he'd been there before. Hannah appeared 5 seconds later, barefoot, her hair up, that same glass of wine in her hand. They kissed without hesitation, no nerves, no guilt, like they'd done it 100 times. I paused the footage there. That was all I needed. The rest could stay buried. The next morning I packed a small bag. No note, no warning. I told work I needed a week, personal reasons. I hit the highway before sunrise and didn't look back until the city lights were a memory. I drove 12 hours straight to Cody, Montana, an old friend's place, a farmhouse on the edge of nowhere, where the stars outnumber people and silence has a weight to it. He didn't ask what happened, just handed me a beer and pointed me toward the shed where he kept the old point .22 rifles. We spent the week in a rhythm that didn't require words, waking early, brewing coffee over open flame, shooting at rusted cans lined up on wooden fences. I let the stillness stretch into my bones. I let the air scrub the noise from my thoughts. Sometimes I'd sit on the edge of the corral, watching the horses graze and think about how long she'd been lying. Not just the affair, but the subtle rewrites of our history, the revision of who we were, what we meant. Every time she called me babe with that soft sigh, every touch that was just 1 second too short, the missed calls, the late nights, the excuses. It hadn't started last week. This had roots that went deeper than I wanted to admit. I came back different. The man who left had hope knotted up behind his ribs. The man who returned didn't need hope anymore. He had clarity, and clarity is colder than rage. It cuts cleaner, leaves no trace of warmth behind. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sun was setting low, casting long shadows across the lawn. I turned off the ignition and just sat there. My hands were steady. My heart was silent. The game was already beginning. She just didn't know she was playing it yet. It took 3 days before I slipped into the garage without her noticing. Hannah was in the kitchen, laughing at some video on her phone, while I moved like smoke through the shadows. I kept my steps soft, my breath shallow. The garage had always been my domain. Tools hung with military precision, shelves organized by weight and use. But her things had begun to creep in. A scarf over a saw handle, a basket of cleaning supplies shoved between my drill cases, and wedged behind the shelving unit, hidden like a secret too proud to burn, I found her old canvas bag. Not the one she took to work, not the stylish things she carried to dinners, but the forgotten one, stained at the corners and stuffed with pieces she probably thought I'd never look through. Inside was a small envelope with a single key taped to the flap, a brass safety deposit key, still bearing the bank's name on a tiny faded sticker. I held it up to the light and something clenched inside my chest. This wasn't just another hiding spot. It wasn't a love letter or perfume-stained note. This was deeper. This was deliberate. That night, after she drifted off to sleep with the television humming low, I got to work. I forged the authorization form in less than an hour, matching her signature stroke by stroke. Years of watching her sign birthday cards and school forms had paid off. The next morning, I walked into the bank dressed like a man with nothing to hide. Collared shirt, wedding ring polished, documents in order. The clerk barely blinked before leading me to the back. The safety deposit room was colder than I expected. I opened the box, breathing slow and shallow, bracing for photographs or letters or maybe a stack of cash that would whisper sins I hadn't imagined yet. What I found was worse. The first thing I pulled out was a necklace I didn't recognize. Gold, delicate, something elegant that she'd never once worn in all the years I'd known her. A piece like that doesn't hide quietly unless it's meant to. Beneath it, a collection of photos, dozens of them. Most were old, curled edges, faded exposure, but every single one had the same man, the same face, her mechanic. They were laughing in some, kissing in others. One showed them on a beach I couldn't name. Another, in front of a tree I now knew from a picture Mason had drawn once. The crooked birch near our street just outside the diner. One photo showed them in front of a Christmas tree. She looked younger, softer, and in her arms a child. The back of the photo was dated, 2006, a full year before we met. I set the photos down with shaking hands and pulled out one last item, a rental agreement, a trailer, on the outskirts, signed under an alias I knew was hers, same handwriting, different name, rented for 6 months, still active. She hadn't just kept a man, she'd kept a second life. I took nothing from the box. I put everything back in perfect order. But before I closed the lid, I scanned the rental agreement and emailed myself a copy. Then I walked out of that bank without looking back, hands cold, eyes dry, as if someone else had done it all for me. For the next 2 days, I said nothing. I moved through the house like a man passing through a museum of his own failure. Every glance she gave me felt like a test, every smile a performance, and I let her win. I let her believe the play was still on. Then on Thursday, I suggested we take a weekend trip, just the three of us. Some time away, I said. We deserved it. She agreed too quickly, like she wanted a reset, like she thought the rot could still be painted over if we got far enough from home. We drove to a tent campsite near the lake, one of those family packages where the tents are already staked down, and there's a little fire pit with benches. Mason loved it. He ran through the pines while I stacked firewood, smiling like a man who hadn't already seen the collapse coming. That night after we ate, I told her I was going to find more wood. She nodded, distracted by her wine. But I didn't go far. I walked back to the car, opened the trunk, and laid everything out. Copies of the photos, the rental agreement, the forged access slip, even a still image printed from the camera footage showing her and the mechanic in that frozen kiss. Then I tucked it all into the same dish towel I'd found the concert tickets in and left it right there, under her travel bag in the back. I closed the trunk soft. When morning came, I pretended to sleep. I heard the zipper, the rustle of fabric, and then nothing for almost 10 minutes. No movement, just silence. Then finally the soft crunch of her footsteps returning. I kept my eyes closed until she sat down across the fire pit from me. When I opened them, she was already crying. Quiet tears, not the wild kind, the kind that meant she'd seen it all and still didn't know how to erase what she'd done. I didn't move. I didn't even look at her directly. I stared into the ashes, picked up a twig, and poked the charred remains of last night's fire until they collapsed inward. She started to say something, but I cut her off with just one sentence. Now you'll understand what cold really looks like. And I didn't speak another word. When we got home from the campsite, she didn't speak for hours. I watched her move through the house like a ghost who hadn't figured out she was dead yet. Careful, weightless, avoiding eye contact with me and her own reflection. Mason ran upstairs to play video games, unaware the storm outside his headphones was just beginning to crack open. I stayed in the garage most of the day, stripping an old cabinet down to raw wood just to keep my hands busy. Every scrape of the sander felt like carving the edge off a scream. The next morning, her side of the bed was cold. She'd taken the car. I waited and waited. By nightfall, she still hadn't come back. I didn't panic. That was the old me, the one who believed in explanations. Instead, I cooked dinner for Mason, read him his bedtime book, and sat by the window afterward with a cup of black coffee, watching the road for headlights that never came. It wasn't until the second day, just after dusk, that my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it ring out. The voicemail that followed wasn't her voice. It was a deputy from the next county over. They had her in holding, said she'd been picked up drunk and screaming at some dive bar 3 towns out. Someone had called the cops after she broke a chair over a pool table. She resisted arrest, had to be carried out. The words came flat and clinical, but every syllable peeled a layer off the illusion she tried so hard to preserve. I drove out in silence. No music, just the hum of the road and the slow burn of adrenaline as I pulled up to the squat little building glowing under a broken neon sign. When I walked inside, the officer behind the glass didn't ask questions, just nodded toward a bench where Hannah sat with smeared mascara and a split lip. She looked up like she expected me to yell. I didn't. I just signed the form, thanked the deputy, and walked her to the truck. She didn't say a word the entire ride home. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and her breath stank of cheap whiskey and desperation. I rolled the window down. Back at the house, she stood in the kitchen doorway, like she was waiting for permission to speak. I dropped the keys in the bowl and turned to face her. Her voice cracked before the words could even form. I'm sorry. I waited. It didn't mean anything. There it was, the cliché, spoken like it was supposed to wipe the slate clean. I could feel my jaw tighten, but I kept still. I need you to be honest, I said. My voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It felt like gravel in a dry throat. And she broke. Tears again. This time harder, messier. She dropped to the floor like someone had cut her strings, and when she finally spoke again, it came out in a whisper I almost didn't believe. He's the father. I didn't ask who. I didn't need to. She meant the child she lost, the one she told me had been a miscarriage, the one she said she had during a bad breakup before we ever met. I'd sat on the floor with her the night she told me about it, holding her hand while she cried. I thought I was comforting her, thought I was part of her healing, but I wasn't even in the right story. I turned and walked out without another word. The bike was still parked under the carport. I hadn't ridden it in months, but that night I needed the sound, the speed, the chaos. Rain had started to fall, fat, cold drops that hit like nails as I sped through the empty streets. The wind tore at my face. I didn't wear a helmet. I didn't care. Somewhere along Route 6, just before the old iron bridge, I came around a curve too hard and too fast. Headlights burst into view, low and wide. A convertible. I swerved. Tires screamed. Gravel spun out from under me. The bike slipped. I went down hard, the metal groaning beneath me as I slammed into the ditch. For a second, everything stopped. No pain, no sound. Just the sensation of air leaving my lungs like someone had stolen it with a fist. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, not because I'd survived, but because I finally felt something sharp enough to prove I was still awake inside this nightmare. I lay there in the mud, rain soaking through my jacket, and laughed until my ribs hurt. I couldn't tell if it was freedom or madness crawling through me, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel powerless. I pulled myself up, limped the bike upright, and walked it the 2 miles back home in the dark. By the time I stepped into the garage, dripping and bruised, she was asleep again, or pretending to be. I didn't care. Something inside me had shifted out on that road. She thought this was the collapse, that all she had to do was cry hard enough, beg long enough, and I'd fold. But I wasn't folding. I was sharpening. The crash had done something to me. Not physically. I'd walked away with nothing more than a bruised hip and a scuffed knuckle. But inside, in the place where all my quiet used to live, something new was building. I stopped talking unless I had to. My eyes had adjusted to the dim, and the shadows didn't bother me anymore. They felt honest, at least. Hannah tried to cling to normal like a woman drowning in calm water. She cooked breakfast the next day, even smiled when she set my plate down. I didn't touch it, didn't even look up. That silence was my first move, and it rattled her more than any scream ever could. She started folding laundry obsessively, cleaning the fridge twice in one afternoon, watching the door like it might breathe. I began to plan. At night, when she fell asleep on the couch with her phone pressed tight in her hand, I sat in the basement with my notebook, listing names, places, dates. I mapped it all out, not for revenge, but for precision. This wasn't about hurting her. This was about building something she couldn't crawl out from. Step one was the paperwork. She thought the marriage still stood. She clung to the idea that we were patching holes when I'd already set fire to the floorboards. I filed for divorce under a confidential motion, citing irreconcilable betrayal. My attorney was a friend of a friend. Quiet, efficient, loyal. He filed the custody claim the same day. Hannah didn't even know. She was too busy trying to lure me back into the illusion with warm coffee and softer tones. She didn't notice the cracks growing under her feet. Step two was the plumber, the one from the video, the mechanic's sidekick, the guy she thought I didn't recognize. His face had been in the footage, twice, once stepping inside, and again walking out 30 minutes later with her arm looped through his. I called him under the pretense of needing emergency work done in the upstairs bathroom. The leak was fake, but the tension wasn't. When he showed up, I made small talk, asked about his job, about Eddie, about how long he'd known Hannah. He didn't bite, just shrugged, wiped his hands, and asked where the leak was. I let him work in silence while I prepared the real trap. The folder had been prepared days ago, a collection of financial records, fake transfers from a fake account linked to her dead aunt's estate, fabricated by a friend in data forensics who owed me more than one favor. I left the folder in the fireplace, half tucked into a log pile like someone forgot it. Something damning enough to suggest Hannah had been moving money illegally. Just enough to look real. Just enough to scare a man into looking out for himself. I caught the plumber in the hallway as he packed up. "I'm sure you've seen worse," I said, nodding toward the fireplace. He paused, glanced at the folder, then back at me. "Just curious, does she still use that joint account from her aunt?" His jaw twitched. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The seed was planted. Step three was the dinner. I told Hannah I wanted to try. Told her we should talk. I cooked her favorite: steak, garlic potatoes, asparagus roasted in lemon. I lit candles. I set the table. She looked at me like I was a ghost trying to smile, but she didn't dare question it. She slipped on a red dress I hadn't seen in 2 years and came to the table with makeup freshly done. Halfway through the meal, the notary arrived. I introduced him as a friend from the bank, said he was helping us sign off on some old asset adjustments, cleaning up accounts, paperwork, the usual. Hannah nodded like she understood, like she wanted to believe she was being let in again. I placed a thin stack of papers in front of her and handed her a pen. She barely skimmed the first page before signing. Then another. Then another. She didn't ask what it was. She never even read the line that gifted me full property rights to the house and waived her claim to future spousal support. I smiled. The notary left. She poured wine. She thought we were healing. She didn't know she'd just signed her own defeat, sealed inside a dinner she'd begged for with tears and forgiveness. I let her sleep that night with her head on my shoulder. I even brushed her hair back once, gently, the way I used to before the storm. She murmured something soft and buried her face deeper into my chest. She had no idea that I was already gone. No idea that the legal threads were tightening around her wrists. And when the final knot pulled, there wouldn't be anyone left to hear her scream. After the crash, something inside me hardened for good. I didn't limp, didn't bleed, but I walked away different. The kind of different that doesn't go away with time or distance. Hannah noticed. She tried harder, smiling more, cooking dinner again, asking if I wanted to talk about us. I nodded sometimes, kissed her on the temple, let her believe. I gave her hope like it was rope, then watched her tie it around her own neck. The days that followed were strategic, quiet. I worked from home, kept Mason's routine smooth, made Hannah think I was crawling back toward warmth. In truth, I was closing the gap. The paperwork was already filed. Divorce, full custody, financial disclosure. She hadn't seen it yet, but the fuse had already been lit. Next came the plumber. I called him again under no pretense this time. I know everything, I said. You want to stay out of this? Put it in writing. He didn't argue. A day later, a signed statement landed in my inbox. He blamed her for everything. Said she'd forged account access, tricked him into helping with false transfers. It was all lies, of course, but the kind the court believes when a man's hands are already dirty and desperate. Then I built the final scene. A dinner, steak, candles, soft jazz like we used to play. I poured her wine, told her we should sign off on some financial cleanups for old joint accounts. She barely glanced at the papers before she signed them. Pages that gave me full property rights, revoked her spousal support, and framed her cooperation in the coming fallout. She smiled at me across the table. She thought this was healing. She thought the warmth was real. 3 days later, at 8:42 a.m., the police came to the door. She was in the kitchen wearing my sweatshirt, barefoot, coffee half poured. The knock froze her mid-step. Hannah Lane, the deputy asked, you're under investigation for financial fraud and falsification of legal records. Her mouth moved, but nothing came out. She turned to me, waiting for an answer, a defense. I gave her nothing. They cuffed her beside the refrigerator and walked her out. Mason peeked from the stairs. I caught his eyes, nodded. He went back to his room. He didn't ask questions. He didn't have to. She was gone for 2 nights. Charges pending. Released with restrictions. The court hearing came fast. The footage, the arrest record, her past outburst at the bar. It all told a story, even if the words were mine. The judge didn't hesitate. Custody granted. Visitation denied. Her petition folded like paper under rain. She sent a letter 2 days later. Torn envelope. Her handwriting shaking across the page. I've lost everything, she wrote. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to the insurance department. Just one more piece of proof that she wasn't fit to mother anything but regret. A week later, another envelope came. No note, just the concert tickets, the ones I'd found at the start of all this. I dropped them in the trash without opening the flap. By Friday, the bags were packed. Mason and I didn't say goodbye. We just left. No message, no forwarding address. Just locked doors behind us and silence where her voice used to live. The road ahead didn't promise peace, but it didn't carry her shadow either. The road was long and silent, stretching out before us like a fresh scar across the map. Mason dozed in the passenger seat, his head slumped against the window, his breath slow and even. Outside, the trees blurred into dark ribbons. I kept driving. Somewhere behind us, she was waking up alone, the house echoing with the silence she helped create. There was no goodbye, no note, no explanation, just absence. We stopped in a small town 2 states over, just a motel for now, tucked behind a gas station and a bait shop, where no one knew our names and the air still smelled like pine and dirt instead of perfume and lies. I booked the room under a different name, paid in cash. Mason stirred once, looked around, then curled back under the blanket with no questions. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the reflection in the TV screen. I didn't look angry. I didn't look sad. I just looked like a man who'd done what needed to be done, and finally had the silence to match. The next morning, I took Mason to breakfast at a diner where the waitresses still called people Han and poured refills without asking. He asked for pancakes. I gave him extra syrup. It was the first time in months I'd seen him smile without hesitation. And still, there was more to finish. She kept sending letters. I didn't read them. Didn't have to. I saw her handwriting and knew every word would be stitched with desperation, with the kind of apologies that only come after the damage is irreversible. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd lost. And now she was trying to rebuild something with the same hands that tore it down. I kept forwarding every letter, insurance, court, anyone who needed more evidence of her unraveling. The trail she left behind wasn't just emotional, it was official, paper thin, and legal. Her mental state was under review. Any hope of shared custody was gone now, buried under ink and her own broken decisions. Then one morning I got a call from my lawyer. She's trying to get the charges dropped. Says she was manipulated. Claims the financial records were planted. I leaned back in the chair, watching Mason build a tower of cereal boxes on the motel counter. Let her talk, I said. Let her scream. It won't change what's on paper. The truth didn't need to scream. It only needed to be documented. And the truth was, she signed everything. She handed me the matches while standing in a house of her own lies. And I didn't even have to light it. I just opened the window and let the wind do the rest. A week later, the final blow came quietly. A letter from the court. Custody fully granted. Visitation suspended indefinitely. Her appeal denied without review. It was official. Mason was mine. Our life, mine to rebuild. I stood outside that motel room, letter in hand, while the wind pushed dry leaves across the parking lot. And I felt something loosen in my chest, like the last knot in a rope finally giving out after years of strain. She'd lost everything. And not because I burned it down, because she thought I wouldn't, because she underestimated what silence meant in the hands of a man who had nothing left to protect but his son. I opened the glove box and took out one final piece. The photo I'd taken from the bank box, the one of her and the mechanic on that beach, arms tangled like young love never dies. I stared at it for a moment, then held it to the flame of my lighter. The edges curled first, then the faces vanished. I dropped the ashes into the motel trash. We didn't stay long in that town, just long enough to reset, to breathe without her shadow curling through the corners of the room. Then we left. Headed south this time, to a coast Mason had never seen. I told him we'd start fresh near the ocean, that we'd find a place with waves and sun and new names. He asked if Mom would ever come find us. I looked him in the eyes and told him the truth. She already lost the map. That night I stood barefoot on the motel balcony, the sea breeze cutting through the heat. I watched the sky fade from orange to violet, stars crawling into place. She was probably sitting in our old house right then, alone, quiet, wondering when the fire would stop. It wouldn't, because I wasn't coming back, and neither was the man who used to love her. Let her burn. Let her remember every lie she spoke, every touch she gave away, every smile that wasn't meant for me. Let her cry in that kitchen where she once laughed with him. Let her sleep under sheets that still smell like my detergent. Let her stare at the mirror and see the woman who gave everything up for a moment that meant nothing. I didn't ruin her. She did. I just gave her the ending she wrote herself. That's all for now, folks. Thank you for being with me today and listened. And if you liked my story, please subscribe, hit the like button, and comment below what you think about all this, and what would you do if you were me. Also, don't forget to check my other stories in description below.